When we looked at suprematism, we were talking about how Malevich was trying to separate the forms that he painted from nature around him. And the reason he was doing this is he was trying to discover connections uh, between art and the inspiration of true feeling, or what he called supreme emotion. And in order to focus on the relationship between art and those emotions, he needed to sever the relationship between art and the physical world. And as he moves to complete abstraction, obviously the external subject matter of the painting totally disappears. And this has a couple of different effects on art. On the one hand, Malevich intends the painting to take you with it. As it abandons the world around you, he wants you, the viewer, to also abandon the world around you. As he talks about, immerse yourself into this great beyond that he's created through these images. They're modern icons meant to inspire us to move to a spiritual realm. Remember that also this coincides with the October Revolution of 1917, and this idea of leaving the world behind can be seen as a quasi-spiritual parallel to the political move of leaving tradition behind, deeply ingrained traditions behind, with the revolution of 1917. And remember, those ideas are well in the air in advance of the revolution. So on the one hand, right, you follow the painting away from this world. But on the other hand, and this is a bit more theoretical, once the painting doesn't make any reference to objects outside of itself, then what does the painting make reference to? And in that respect, it makes reference to itself as an object. It makes reference back to its own materials. So if the painting is about anything, it's about its material nature. It's about the paint. It's about the canvas. And that's why I think Malevich spends so much time, so much meticulous energy in painting what are essentially flat fields of color. That when you get close, and you can see this even in these larger images, that when you get close, you realize that there's no element that's not meticulously wrought by the artist, built up slowly through meticulous brushstrokes. And this idea that by abandoning representation, the artist makes the subject matter of the painting, the materials of the painting. This leads us to the next Russian movement that grew directly out of suprematism, and that's constructivism. Vladimir Tatlin is the leader of the constructivist movement, and it did indeed grow directly out of suprematism. Tatlin studied under Malevich. The work that you're seeing here on the left was part of Malevich's exhibition in 1915, the 010 exhibition. Remember, 10 artists seeking the sort of pared down 0 degree of painting. Malevich was one of them. And this work, in fact, the counter relief you see on your left, was in fact part of the 010 exhibition in 1915. Now, a few years later, 2 years after the revolution in 1919, Tatlin writes a manifesto, the Constructivist Manifesto, and he talks about what his attempts are, what he's trying to achieve, what constructivists are trying to achieve, and this is very helpful for us. One of the things that he mentions is that constructivist art objects, like his counter relief, are not created solely for their aesthetic beauty. And this counters sort of the long tradition of art, making art is making something beautiful. But rather, the reason constructivists make art is to analyze the materials of construction, to reveal something about the materials that they're using. And there you can see the direct contact back to Malevich, non-representational art, helping us then to pay attention to the materials in use. And this is then emphasized under the constructivists. The reason to make art is to analyze the materials of construction. There's nothing wrong if it's attractive as an outcome, but that should not be the motivation for making the work of art. Right? So The idea is that we analyze the materials of construction, and in order to do that, in order for the viewer and the artist each to focus on materials, the works of art should openly exhibit their mode of construction. So the work that we're seeing on the left is still during the suprematist period, but it's quite obviously in spirit with the constructivists. It's openly reveals its mode of construction, makes you aware of its material. The viewer focuses solely on the juxtaposition of these different materials, and so each of them takes its character, emphasizes its character through juxtaposition to the objects next to it as they intermingle, permeate each other. Also, another important issue is that almost all of the material is industrial. This is part of the agenda of the constructivists, is to use non-art materials because they're not trying to make something of aesthetic beauty. They're trying to make sort of a non-art. Now, I have a video here that I found on YouTube that focuses on the material, so I'm just going to kind of try to play the video, and we'll see if it works here. And I'll just shut up, and we can look at it more closely. So for the next minute and a half, we'll get to sort of explore. Notice the bolts that have been left visible. Again, the mode of construction is never hidden in the work because it is, in fact, part of the subject matter of the work, is how it's put together. Also notice that these are all sort of scrap industrial materials that have been manipulated by Tatlin. So the work is really radically modern. It's everything that traditional sculpture was not. I brought in, obviously, probably the single most famous sculptor of all time, Michelangelo, to sort of make this comparison. What Tatlin is making is an anti-sculpture. It's made by construction rather than reduction. Normally, sculptures were made by carving away part of a block to reveal the figure within it. And Tatlin is making the sculpture out of cobbling together different bits of cast-off industrial metal. As we saw in the video, you can see that a lot of what is the sculpture itself is not necessarily the materials themselves, but the space around them as well. The area between those two arced pieces of metal is as important, the space there, as the metal themselves. The area encompassed by the turnbuckle and the six pieces of rope is every bit as important as the rope itself. It's about negative space, even more so than it is about the solid mass. And then, of course, the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things, is that since it's not solid, and sculpture is always thought of as solid, and this one is not, but because it's not solid, it doesn't need a base. It hangs on the wall rather than sits on the ground. And that's, I think, is a crucial element. The fact that it floats above the ground is terribly important for constructivist ideas. On the one hand, it shows this direct link back to Malevich and those suprematist squares that Malevich said he intended to look as if they were floating. Because, of course, those squares were meant to lead us to something more spiritual, a plane above the physical realm. On the other hand, the fact that it's floating is important for constructivism as it's developing. Tatlin, in the Constructivist Manifesto, claims that constructivist artists look at solid matter as a symbol for intellectual ideas, that solid matter is intellectual matter. So in other words, what he's trying to do here is show us that these solid forms, these industrial materials, have, interestingly, some connection with metaphysics. And for us in the 21st century, that's tough to think about. How does industry relate with ideas of spirituality and metaphysics? But in the early 20th century, the idea that industry became a symbol of the modern world and the possibility of casting off tradition and moving into a new kind of society. And I think there was a great hope in industry and machinery that we have sort of become jaded against in the sort of post-industrial world. Now, it's easy to think of numerous influences on what Tatlin is doing with this cobbled together collage, if you will, of found objects. Obviously, synthetic cubism is a huge influence on this. Picasso was doing this sort of thing as he and Braque began cubism by taking objects that have been discarded and putting them together to make a work of art by manipulating them a little bit. And in fact, Tatlin had traveled to Paris in 1914 in advance of the 010 exhibition and actually had met Picasso. And so what he's doing is in fact very, very similar to what Picasso's doing. At the same time, it's worth noting, and we didn't see any in class, Picasso was also making synthetic cubist sculptures. And so obviously our constructivist, Tatlin in particular, owes a lot to these as well. Where again, it's found materials that have been put together to establish some sense of meaning. But I think that this comparison, when we see them side by side, highlights what are some of the central ideas in constructivism. You'll notice that Picasso's materials make reference to other things. He transforms them so that the wood becomes a violin of sorts, right? The architectural molding in blue off to the right becomes sort of the neck of a bottle, and the base of the bottle down below, even though the rest of the bottle is just drawn onto the two pieces of wood on the side. And this is an important element. Picasso is taking the materials and he's painting them or disguising them to turn them into references to other things. Tatlin's sculpture, on the other hand, doesn't do that at all. His materials only refer to themselves. They're undecorated. They're not meant to evoke anything other than the materials from which it's constructed. And this is what sets the constructivists apart from pretty much everybody we've looked at this point, with the exception, of course, of the suprematists. But then there's something more earthbound with constructivism. There's something more interested in the modes of construction and industrial forms than we've seen with suprematism. The most famous constructivist work was a monument that Tatlin had designed to commemorate the 3rd anniversary of the October Revolution of 1917. And this is a model of it here. It's a working model for what was intended to be a 1,300-foot tall building. Here's a sort of a montage reproduction of what the building would have looked like. It obviously was never built. Simply impossible. But it was meant to be 1,300 feet tall. The double helix that spirals around to the top obviously makes some reference. I don't know when DNA was discovered, but it sure seems as if there's something about genetic coding here. In this case, they provided ramps that led from the base up to the top, and in the design they would have contained escalators that would have brought people all the way to the top of the building. The plan for the construction was to use entirely modern materials, steel and glass, different geometric shapes contained within that double helix. You can make out some of them. There's a cube at the bottom labeled A. There's a pyramid, a right-angled pyramid labeled B. C is a cylinder, and at the very top there's a sort of a half dome, if you will, a half of a sphere. Geometric shapes, of course, are mental, intellectual ideals as forms, and we should remember the Constructivist Manifesto that talked about the fact that physical forms are symbols for intellectual forms, and that, I think, is coming through here. Modern materials have a direct connection to mental ideas. Now, in the plan for this building was also to be functional. In other words, it wasn't simply decorative like the Eiffel Tower, although that's an interesting comparison, because the Eiffel Tower was certainly a symbol of Western progress, and this was meant to be a symbol of Russian progress. But unlike the Eiffel Tower, it was meant to function as a building. So the cube at the bottom was meant to hold a lecture hall. So inside of that steel and glass cube, you would have a place for lectures. And again, the public face of this building is important. Down near the ground, or nearer the ground, is a hall for lectures to engage the public with the building. The pyramid above it was to house executive offices for the new party. The cylinder above that was to be an information center, and it was going to have outdoor loudspeakers, a radio and telegraph. It would broadcast information out to the people of the world. Again, this building was not meant to be contained, but to present to the public, to be populist. Finally, the hemisphere at the very top housed radio equipment, and actually projectors as well. And it would shine messages onto the clouds up above for the people. So this thing really did engage with the space around it, just as the counter reliefs that Tatlin had also done on a much smaller scale. The interesting thing is that each of those shapes then rotated at different speeds. They were motorized. And so the lecture hall at the bottom would rotate one time per year, whereas the hemisphere at the top, broadcasting those messages on the clouds, would rotate one time per hour, so the messages would move around as well. This is an important element because it's really one of our earliest examples of what we call kinetic art, art that moves, that's designed to take place over the elapsing of time. Again, connections to Cubism, maybe. Cubism was always about the fourth dimension, and here Tatlin's is as well. The work of art can only truly be experienced if you watch it elapse for an entire year, as the lecture hall A rotates within an entire year. The constructivists are particularly interested in kinetic art because it's a kind of art that as it elapses over time, it engages with the space around it on a certain level. And the sculpture is not just, it doesn't just present solid materials, static solid materials, but presents materials that move through the space around them, so that the sculpture becomes as much the containing area as it does the sculpture itself. Now Mugabo gives us another kind of kinetic art, as you can see in the title, Kinetic Construction Standing Wave. It's also plain industrial materials. It's a simple steel rod that comes out of this cubic base. Again, an interest in geometric forms as symbols of intellectual ideas, and simple industrial materials, a simple steel rod. But the work of art had a little switch on it, and inside the black box at the bottom was an electric motor. So if you flipped the switch, the motor turned on, and the rod started to vibrate and spin in space. And as it did, it became this wave pattern that you see here, and it becomes a three-dimensional object, at least to your eye. But this is so fascinating because, of course, the sculpture that you see, the three-dimensional space that you see, is really in a way a sort of optical illusion. It's what's left from the steel rod itself, blurring in space, so that, in fact, it's a sculpture that isn't a sculpture. It's a sculpture that is the space around it as much as it is the the object itself. It's not about mass solidity anymore. It's really about the engagement with the space around us. Part of me thinks with the Bolshevik Revolution and the beginning of the Soviet regime, and the idea of the original ideals of the Soviet Empire, which is that all of us are part of a community that we have an impact on and that we have a responsibility to. When you make sculptures that have something beyond themselves, that they're not just this solid object over here, but they engage with the space around them, I kind of see that as a metaphor for these early Soviet ideas about the relationship between the thing, the individual, and the community around it. The sculpture is not an individual thing separated from the world around it. It engages with that in the same way that, at least in the ideals of the Soviet regime, right, in the ideals of communism, is that you would be part of a community, communal, and would share that responsibility. Gabo also makes sort of static sculptures, but even those static sculptures engage with the space around them. This head of a woman is virtually all space and no mass. There's no exterior surface to it whatsoever. We saw Picasso doing that with his little bottle that he uses the piece of architectural molding for the neck, and then draws the bottle on the walls to suggest the bottle. Gabo takes that a step further, where he gives us the entire sort of, I would imagine, with the hairdo, the head, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the shoulders, the hair, but he suggests surface, suggests solids, without actually depicting any of them. And again, into the corner, crowded in the corner. The materials he's using here is also important when we think about constructivism. It's celluloid, which is a machine-made, an industrially made material, and it's basically a precursor of plastic. It had been first developed back in the 1860s. It's about a chemical emulsification of various materials that comes up with these sort of hard plastic forms that can be bent in a way and are somewhat obviously more permanent than paper, cardboard, and whatnot. But he's using a modern material for this, an industrially made material. His brother made very similar works. Antoine Pevsner is the brother of Naum Gabo. Naum Gabo changed his name, Naum Pevsner, to Naum Gabo, simply to avoid confusion between these two artist brothers, so that they would never get their works mistaken as they signed them. Again, we can see, using celluloid, in this case uncolored celluloid, that Pevsner is depicting space without depicting mass. It's increasingly even more transparent by the fact that it's translucent, that the light playing through the sculpture is as much an element of our aesthetic appreciation of the sculpture as the forms themselves are. So we can see that the reflection on the wall behind it plays as much a role in this image as the materials that make up the sculpture itself. You'll notice that with Pevsner, and also with later works by Naum Gabo, the works are extraordinarily precise when it comes to mathematics. Pevsner gives us almost machine-like discs, precisely rendered. In fact, as he and Gabo wrote about making art, they talked about the fact that art was inspiration controlled by mathematics. And I think that fits with the constructivists, because mathematics are indeed an intellectual construction themselves. And remember that for the constructivists, the physical object is a symbol, a metaphor for intellectual ideas. This becomes even more enhanced when we get to something that's as mathematically rigorous and precise as what we see with Pevsner and Gabo. Now, during World War II, both Gabo and Pevsner fled first to England and then eventually to the United States. where they spent the rest of their careers. And the work from the Phillips collection that you see on your right is made after Gabo emigrates to, if you will, the New World, to America, using translucent materials like his brother had done. And now we have these plastic filament wires that create shapes and space and appear to be solid when in fact they are not. Even the, well, here I'll try to trace the parts I'm talking about. Even the semicircular loop in the middle has a sense of solidity. That edge of that plastic has a sense of line, when in fact it's just the way the light plays through the translucent plastic. Here we see it from the sides. This idea of using translucent materials helps to break down the solidity even further. It's very modern, it's synthetic, it's industry turned into art. But you can see it's also absolutely fascinated by mathematics. The precise measurement of the placement for those wires, how they're affixed to the plastic, is almost hidden everywhere as it's tied around the plastic frame. And then the spreading of those wires from a single point in the corner to each of these equally spaced endpoints gives it that wonderful sort of bends within bends, these sort of organic forms that are made from mathematics. Again, this is intellectual matter. And so it's very much following exactly what Tatlin said, that solid matters reflect intellectual ideas. And again, true to its materials, they're unadorned. The sculpture is as much about the material as it is about any sort of reference to the world outside it. Another constructivist sculptor and painter is Alexander Rodchenko, studied under Malevich to begin with, and then studied under Tatlin. Also making sculptures that are mathematically precise and then more space than they are solid. If we think about what makes the sculpture, it is the space it contains as much as it is the solid elements that make it up. And again, a work of extraordinary precision. What Gabo did was to take a single piece of plywood. Plywood we take for granted these days, but in the early 20th century, it was a modern industrial material. And he takes a single piece of plywood and he cuts a series of concentric circles out of it. So he simply cuts it into a circle, then he cuts a smaller circle out of that. And if we were to stack all these pieces together, they would fit together as a single circular, flat, two-dimensional piece of plywood. And what he's done then is he's rotated them in space and wired them together so that this single two-dimensional object becomes, in fact, three-dimensional space. Through the hand of the artist, it's transformed. So again, constructivist, it's true to these industrial materials. It's as much about the void between the solids as it is about the solids themselves. Sorry about that. In the National Gallery, we have a small-ish Rodchenko piece, simply an untitled painting where he's taken a piece of uncovered wood. He hasn't primed it or prepped it. Painters painted on wood back in the Middle Ages, but they would cover it with some sort of priming element to disguise the wood surface so that all we cared about was what was painted on the top. Rodchenko leaves the wood visible and paints over the top of it these precise machine-like forms that seem as if they're insights into parts of engines or other forms of machinery, but at the same time leaving the wood grain visible. And I wonder, on a certain level, if this isn't a metaphor for the ways in which industry transforms nature into something modern, into something new. So Rodchenko is active both in sculpture and painting and applying constructivist ideas there. He's best remembered, however, as a photographer and as a graphic designer. He really is a terrific photographer. And this image of a guard standing at the Shukov Tower shows us the same interests that the other constructivists have had unadorned industrial materials as a subject for the photograph, materials that are arranged in a way that captures space without being a solid. And then as he moves into photography, what we see Rodchenko begin to do, and this is important for the constructivists, is to work with interesting and modern and untraditional camera angles. So instead of righting his camera horizontally, he presents the guard on this incredible angle, and the angle on which the guard is standing. It presents this really dynamic set of lines, none of which are true to pure horizontals or verticals, and really become this incredible composition. Rodchenko would eventually, here's another photograph by Rodchenko. In 1921, Rodchenko would entirely abandon fine art, stop making paintings and sculptures altogether. He said that, and turned sort of entirely to photography. And he said it was rather liberating, photography was. There was a famous quote that he said, when he took up photography, he could leave Rubens behind. Rubens was a 17th century Flemish painter, renowned for sort of human flesh, really sort of dramatic, but very courtly, very mannered in his painting. And what Rodchenko meant when he said he was leaving Rubens behind were a number of different things. First, obviously, traditional compositions get left behind. With the fire escape on the left, again, he's taking these extraordinary viewpoints, odd camera angles, framing choices, all of which make the materials that are in the picture seem more abstract. So the two buildings, for example, stop looking like buildings and instead transform simply into compositional elements. We are placed within the space created by the ladder and the supports and the building on the other side, but not in a traditional way. Again, with the bars on the Shukov Tower, right? We get this series of angles and interplays of lines that, as we look at them, the great appeal is the abstract quality of those designs rather than its realism, if you will. So when he's leaving Rubens behind, he's leaving behind traditional compositions. He's leaving behind, I think, on a certain level, subject matter is less important to him than how it's composed within the frame. The fact that he's coming up with these new kinds of viewpoints, these new compositions, these new framing elements. And then I think the biggest thing for Rodchenko when he leaves Rubens behind is the idea that he's now using a machine to make images. Now, he used a machine, obviously, to cut that three-dimensional sculpture that we saw, but here the machine is everything. The machine intervenes. Without it, he can't make this. He might have used a machine to cut those circles for that sculpture, but he might have been able to do that by hand as well. And here he's got a new tool, the camera, which is itself a machine, and it is this intervention between him and the image. He's not physically manipulating himself in the same way. A new way to make images. Okay. Now, these radical viewpoints, these angles that he's exploring with his photographs become the basis for his graphic designs as well. And constructivist graphic design is spectacular. It's still today, 100 years later, energetic, modern, phenomenal. This is an advertisement for a bookshop, and she's screaming books, right? And it's one of his photographs that he's excerpted from it and used it as part of the graphic design. And in fact, Rodchenko, I think if he's best remembered for one thing, it's as a graphic designer. Because when he abandoned painting altogether in 1921, it was for poster design. And he begins to experiment with the idea of collaging photographs as part of the poster design. The term we use for that is photo montage, a relatively new technique at this time, a collage made from photos. And when the constructivists talked about photo montage, what they talked about was they weren't haphazardly grabbing parts of photographs. What they were doing was trying to choose the most expressive part of the photograph and remove it and use it in a new composition so that the composition is then collaged from the most expressive parts of multiple photographs. I think you can see, saying it that way, the direct relationship between constructivist photo montage and Malevich and his abstraction. Because Malevich's abstraction was, of course, very much excerpting from reality and moving it into something more expressive by excerpting it. And the constructivists are very much doing the same thing. Here's another Rodchenko constructivist graphic design where you can see the sort of expressive power of this. A model of the Earth becoming the top of that man's head, planes circling the Earth. Even though he gives it a title, it's somewhat sort of elusive as to exactly what he means by that. For Rodchenko, another reason to leave Rubens behind was that Rubens painted for collectors. Rubens painted for a single person, and this was true for really all painters in a way, isn't it? When you make a painting, anything shy of a public mural, you're painting for one person. You're painting for an elite single audience. And by moving to printmaking, to moving to posters and whatnot, Rodchenko is able to become more populist. He's able to become more democratic, if you will. Not in the political sense, but in the idea of making art for the people. Art that is not a single impression, but art that can be more widely distributed. This is another way in which he's leaving Rubens behind. Here's a book of love poems that Rodchenko designed. The author, Vladimir Mayakovsky. The title of the book, Pro Eto. There's Mayakovsky's name on the bottom in Cyrillic, meaning simply about this. And he not only designs the cover, but designs pages to go alongside the poems on the inside. The book is a series of love poems, all addressed to the woman on the cover, who we see on this page as well, in multiple images. And the photo montages are each meant to take expressive images based on words from each of the poems. They're not meant to illustrate them so much as to express the feelings of the poems by taking these expressive elements of different photographs and simply putting them back together again. Here's another page from Pro Eto. I've not actually read the poetry to try to make connections between the images that we see here and the words in the poems, but the illustrative capacity is, I think, very much the same way that the poem is meant to have an impact. It's through sound, it's not necessarily through narrative, but through how associations that we have between words and ideas, between words and feelings. And Rodchenko uses his images in the same way, not narrative, not illustrating per se, but evoking ideas, evoking sentiment, evoking emotion. So for Rodchenko, these works of art, these photomontages, and the idea of using poster art is socio-political. It's a tool. It's utilitarian. And for this reason, Rodchenko, while he began very abstract, begins in the 1920s to move away from abstraction. He begins to move toward recognizable imagery. He wants it to communicate. Right? At the same time, he wants his works of art not to be elitist, not to be made for a limited audience. That would be too capitalist. As part of the new communist nation, he wants it to be for the people. more broadly populist. This revealed what was becoming a split in constructivism in the 1920s. There was one side of the constructivists that was very much interested in this sort of utilitarian kind of art as a socio-political tool. And there was another side, sort of Gabo and Pevsner, who was interested in abstraction and art as a sort of metaphysical idea, sort of closer to the roots in suprematism. Rodchenko is obviously with the first group, utilitarianism, socio-political ramifications of art being used to help spread messages. Another artist who, despite his abstraction, is part of that first group of the utilitarian side of art is Lissitzky, L. Lissitzky. His first name is Eliezer, goes by L. Lissitzky. His forms are quite obviously abstract. They quite obviously owe something back to Malevich, but he adds texts that bring it right back down to earth. So the white circle on the right-hand side has words directly next to it, Belich, which means beat the whites. The whites were one side in the Russian Revolution. On the left, the red triangle, it said klinom krasnim. This means with the red wedge. The red were, of course, the other side in the Russian Revolution, the Red Revolution, and it is piercing into the white circle. And as you can see, red wedges look almost like Star Wars spaceships fighting against the black and bringing white over darkness, if you will, light over darkness. This is produced in lithography, as were most of Rodchenko's photomontages. A lithograph is a treatment of a piece of stone, a piece of limestone, so that parts of it hold ink and parts of it repel ink, and then you print from that chemically treated stone. Certainly, with both Lissitzky and Rodchenko, we're talking about works of art that are mass-produced to serve society. In fact, the Beat the Whites image was made to actually be displayed on the side of railway cars to spread that message through the land, to beat the whites with the red wedge. Another Lissitzky lithograph on the left, he had seen a revival of a play in 1920. The original play was written and produced in 1913, but there was a revival in 1920 that Lissitzky had gone to. The original play was a suprematist musical called Victory Over the Sun, and Malevich, our great suprematist artist, had designed both the costumes and the stage for this play. And the words of the play, the libretto, if you will, because it is in fact a musical, was a language of sounds without meaning. Sounds divorced from any kind of reference to the natural world, a new language of sound itself, where the sounds were maintained only for their expressive quality. And Malevich and the stages of the play called this new language Zaum, Z-A-U-M. And we can certainly think of futurists in this respect, and how really the suprematists saw themselves as being an offshoot of the futurists. Well, Lissitzky sees a revival of this in 1920, and the extraordinarily modern stage design, costumes, the modern staging of this nonsense musical that is meant to evoke pure, supreme feeling really inspired him to make a series of lithographs that were based on the people that he saw in the play, the costume design. Here on the right, we see some of the stage machinery that was used for the play. All of the stage machinery was visible, so even though it was first staged in 1913, there is that connection to the ideas that are developing for the constructivists that machinery, the modes of construction should be left visible, because the work of art is about the way in which it's constructed. Uh, so here is some of the mechanical setting of the stage with some of the mechno-men, the sort of robot-like figures that populated the stage, the figure in the upper right, for example. Our Globetrotters in Time on the left is also one of these, inspired by some of this costume design. We can certainly make out that sort of cubist head at the top, but it's much more difficult to sort of figure out how the rest of it's going to work out. How did that costume design actually work? It's been translated into the geometric forms of constructivism in the hands of Lissitzky. Here is another of the costume designs, again the head at the top, and then these boxes making these sort of robo-men, if you will, these sort of quasi-robots, mechano-men. Certainly what we're seeing with the constructivists, and something we've been seeing in a lot of works of art, is that in the early part of the 20th century is how much they see industry as being a real great benefit to society, almost as if industry is going to save civilization, rescue us from the bonds, free us from the bonds of tradition. And I think that, prior to the war and even slightly after it in some areas, industry is seen as something that could only be positive, that the future was this sort of bright open world of new possibilities. And Lissitzky's picking up on that with these images. Lissitzky's most famous creations were a series of works he called Proun, P-R-O-U-N. And Proun was actually an acronym in Russian. Projects for the Affirmation of the New is what Proun stands for. And what he means by this, Lissitzky does, is that these works that he calls Prouns, and you'll notice they're just numbered and lettered like objects that come off of out of a design studio, prototypes for mass-produced objects. But what he sees them as are sites where painting and architecture intersect, interchanges, if you will, between the two-dimensional world of the painting and the three-dimensional world of architecture. This is important because it's another way in which painting comes off the easel, comes out of the hands of the collector, and becomes engaged with the world around it through becoming more increasingly three-dimensional. Here's a sort of raking view of some of the surface of Proun 19D up at MoMA. And you can see that the two brown elements that come in from the side are both three-dimensional objects that have been, in fact, placed on the surface of the painting and then painted to look even more three-dimensional through Lissitzky's handling of the canvas surface. So these are Prouns. They're intersections of three-dimensional works, that is architecture, and two-dimensional works, painting. Lissitzky even went so far as to make Proun rooms, where the painting now explodes off of the canvas and occupies three-dimensional space. Again, all of this fits with a number of different constructivist ideas that we've been talking about. Works of art that engage with the space around them rather than being isolated to the mass of the object itself. Works of art that serve a broader constituency, a broader community than the elitist world of the collector. Works of art that are true to their materials, that show us the materials in a relatively unadorned fashion. All of these things are wrapped up in Lissitzky's Proun constructions. Another constructivist from Hungary, it was not only isolated to Russia, is Moholy Nagy. It's tough to pronounce based on how it looks. Laszlo Moholy Nagy. GY is a J sound. Following basic constructivist principles here in a work at the National Gallery, even though it's a painting, even though it's an easel painting, it looks as if it's constructed out of non-artistic materials. It looks as if it's a piece of pegboard, a series of semi-translucent geometric shapes that might have been made by some machine somewhere. Everything about it is totally industrial. The title sounds as if it's a model number coming out of a factory. Like Rodchenko, Moholy-Nagy is also fascinated with the camera, using it as a new form of vision, choosing extraordinarily innovative, unexpected viewpoints that turn the different physical forms that we're looking at into geometric patterns, elements of composition. So here we're at the top of a radio tower. We can even see the shielding down below of the building that supports it. Again, this radio tower has something that's as much space as it is solid, unadorned industrial materials, typically constructivist in nature. And yet it becomes this strong diagonal that leads down to a slightly off-kilter rectangle surrounded by a series of shapes that are themselves just umbrellas and seating down below. And then that wonderful fountain plaza presenting a circular motif at the bottom. But again, what Moholy-Nagy wants us to see when we look at this is just pure composition. These different elements turning into the sorts of things that we see in the composition at the left. Abstract shapes, abstract geometrical shapes. And the camera, this mechanical device in the hands of Moholy-Nagy here or Rodchenko elsewhere, becomes this great liberating element, a new way to make pictures. And when we look at Rodchenko's work, he's always finding places where through the things that he's looking here, he's looking through a bit of great work on a window down a street, that by not leveling the camera, by shooting through one form onto another, it abstracts everything that we see, and it becomes a series of just wonderful compositions that are energetic through their diagonals and through the plunging perspectives that he chooses. Finally, with Moholy-Nagy, the last thing he did as he began to experiment with photography was he started realizing that part of photography is capturing the image with the camera. The other part is how you develop it in the darkroom. That you take this matrix that you've made through the shutter onto the light-sensitive film. That it's presented a series of black and white shapes because of the things you're looking at. And Moholy-Nagy realizing, working in the darkroom, that this piece of photosensitive film, once you project onto it the thing that you've taken with your camera, he started to realize that there's another thing you could do with photosensitive paper. You could just simply lay objects on the paper and then expose it to light. And this is really, for him, was a great liberation. He called them photograms, where he just took different objects and simply plunked them down right onto the photosensitive paper and exposed it. No more camera anymore, but rather almost a random series of objects. And he experimented with these through the 1920s, and he's really wonderful, where he lays these objects down and then exposes them to light and comes up with these constructivist composition through photograms. Our last slide from this lecture shows again how well Moholy-Nagy understood photography and how he's experimenting with it in a modern fashion, where he takes now the photogram and takes a photo of it and exposes that, and he gets its reversal in a positive image rather than a negative image on the right. Again, exploring how modern industry can reveal to us a kind of art that reflects these open spaces created by industrial materials, but within now a sort of modern industrial approach to those materials.